So my name is Thomas, and I'm the president of the SSA New South Wales branch. And on behalf of the branch, thank you everyone for joining us this evening. And we'll begin our meeting with an acknowledgement of the country. So in the spirit of reconciliation, the Statistical Society of Australia acknowledges the traditional custodian of country throughout Australia and the connection to land, sea, and community. We pay our respect to the elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples today. And it is my great pleasure today to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Joanna Wang. She is a senior lecturer at the School of Mathematical and Physical Sciences at UTS Sydney. After finishing her PhD in statistics at Sydney University, Joanna was a postdoctoral fellow at UTS and the Sachs Institute. She also worked at the New South Wales BOCSAR, Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research, before rejoining UTS late last year. Her research interests include time series modeling in observational studies, non-response in survey data, and statistical methods for evaluating policy programs. So tonight, Joanna will talk a little bit about how statistics is used to help creating a better justice system, a case study. Okay, Joanna.
Thank you for the introduction. How do I get this box out of the way? Is that better? Yeah. Okay. I'm going to begin with a definition of evaluation. Now, there are many definitions lying around, but I particularly like this one. So Turner, Miller, and Moser defines evaluation as a systematic process that produces a trustworthy account of what was attempted and why. Through the examination of the results, the outcomes of the intervention programs, it answers the questions: what was done, to whom and how, and what outcomes were observed. So the aim of evaluation is to provide evidence about the process and outcome of a program as a way to gain some feedback to inform and guide practical decisions. Now, evaluation can be divided into process evaluation, which looks at what actually occurred in the program to determine how well the program was delivered. Now, the outcome evaluation is what I'm mostly interested in, and it is to identify the outcome and to measure the impact of the program on a particular outcome. And we also want to establish that whatever impact we observe is indeed because of the program, and that is the most difficult part. Now, both process and outcome evaluations are important because the outcome evaluation results would not tell you much about the effectiveness of the program or intervention if the program itself was not even implemented properly. Now, for every piece of research I do in this area, I ask 4 questions. The first one is, what is the policy relevant to research question that we're trying to answer? And to answer this question, what data do we need to collect? And what is available to us? Then how do we use the available data to answer the research question? And lastly, what are the implications of the study and how we can implement the research evidence into policies and practices? Now, statistics, or data science if you want to call it, help us to answer the second and third question. The data we'll be using are determined by research design. So can we do a completely randomized study where we randomly allocate individuals to treatment and control groups? If we can, then that's perfect, because randomized experiment is the gold standard of evaluation because it offers the most convincing evidence of causality. But in many occasions, it's not possible due to ethical or practical reasons. Another research design is non-experimental research, including before and after study, where you compare some pre-intervention measurement with the same measurement after the intervention to see whether there's any change in the outcome variable. But it's very difficult to establish causal relationship because there could be many other explanations or many other factors for the differences you observe. Now, you can also do quasi-experimental studies where you can match the treatment and the control groups based on some key characteristics. Now, the next step is to think about what statistical methodology that we can use to best analyze this data? Do I need to do some time series modeling because the observations are taken at regular time intervals? Or do I need to use hierarchical or multi-level mixed models to account for some nested structure in the data? Now I'm giving you some examples of the kind of question asked in crime and the criminal justice system. Now, one such question is, what is the impact of the lockout laws? On 21st of January 2014, our government announced new restrictions on licensed premises in the King's Cross and CBD entertainment precincts. Now, there are a couple of research questions associated with this policy change. Did the January 2014 reform reduce the incidence of assaults in these areas? Is there any evidence of displacement? Is the reduction in assaults in the King's Cross and CBD larger than the displacement, so we can get a net reduction in assaults? Did the reduction in assaults coincide with the timing of the restriction, and that is between 1:30 and 3 a.m.? Now, to answer this question, you can compare the trends in assaults in these areas before and after the reforms with some control sites. Well, you can also account for any pre-existing trends and seasonal variations. Another question, we're trying to find factors that can be used to classify those who experience repeat intimate partner violence and those who do not. And based on these factors, you can develop a risk assessment tool to discriminate between repeat and non-repeat intimate partner violence victims. Now, the third example is looking at whether the type of legal representation provided to a defendant, that is, whether the defendant had an in-house legal aid lawyer who's paid an annual salary versus private lawyers who are paid according to an hourly rate. Does that legal representation substantially impact the way the case proceeds through the criminal courts? Now, this question was asked because there were concerns that the fee structure works as an incentive to maximize the number of hours spent on a case, which causes a delayed resolution of a case. And the question I'm trying to answer is to assess the effectiveness of a sentence called intensive correction order as compared to short prison sentence in reducing the rate of reoffending. Now, those 4 questions on the previous slide, they are the research project conducted by BOCSAR in the past. And I think it's worthwhile to briefly talk about BOCSAR and what they do. Now, BOCSAR stands for the Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research, and it's a statistical and research agency within the government, within the Department of Communities and Justice. And it has these 3 areas of activities. In research and evaluation, they undertake rigorous evaluations to determine the effectiveness of justice programs and policy. They also monitor the performance and implementation of justice programs. In the modeling, information, and mapping, they monitor patterns and trends in crime and perform statistical analysis on crime and the criminal justice issues. And lastly, in data system, they develop and maintain high quality databases on crime, criminal courts, and custody. And they also create linked criminal justice datasets by incorporating external data sources. And these are the BOCSAR objectives: to identify factors that affect the frequency and distribution of crime, identify factors that affect effectiveness, efficiency, or equity of the New South Wales criminal justice system, and to ensure that this information on crime and justice system is available and accessible to all clients. And this includes the policymakers, the researchers, as well as the general public. Now, you often hear about the underutilization of research evidence into policies and practices in the criminal justice system. And I think BOCSAR is in this perfect position right inside the government because they have the capacity to conduct both qualitative and quantitative research, and they can assist policymakers in the criminal justice system to develop and implement strategies that can reduce crime. Now, outside this type of agency, you probably need a pretty good researcher or academic and practitioner partnership to help increase the use of research evidence in decision making. Now, what data does BOCSAR have? It has New South Wales criminal courts data from 1994, the New South Wales police cops data. I think COPS stand for Computerized Operation Police System, and their own database, the BOCSAR Reoffending Database, or ROD. So it contains all the court appearance for an individual from 1994. So if you're thinking of doing research in crime and criminal justice system, then I strongly recommend you to check them out, because they have a lot of high quality data that you can use. Now I'm going to talk about case study, which is comparing intensive correction order and short prison sentence. And in this case study, I will show you how statistics is used to answer this research question. So I'll begin talking about something called a periodic detention, because ICO, or intensive correction order, was actually introduced to replace periodic detention. So periodic detention was a sentence of imprisonment that required a person to remain in custody for a specific number of days every week, usually on the weekend, and they live in the community 5 days a week. Now, in later stage of this sentence, depending on their compliance, the 2 days of community service work could be undertaken rather than imprisonment. There are, however, major limitations and inequalities of periodic detention, including it was not uniformly available across the state, with limited access in rural and remote areas, and it was not achieving a deterrent or rehabilitative outcome. The Crimes Amendment Act in New South Wales, which came into effect on the 1st of October 2010, abolished periodic detention as a sentencing option and introduced intensive correction order in response to those limitations of periodic detention. So an ICO is an alternative to full-time imprisonment served by an offender by way of intensive correction in the community rather than in a correctional centre. And in New South Wales, an ICO is served under the supervision of Corrective Service New South Wales. So an offender needs to comply with direction from a corrective service supervisor, as well as some mandatory conditions, including a minimum of 32 hours of community service work per month, participation in programs to address offending behavior, and drug and alcohol testing on work and program sites. Programs available to offenders include programs that are targeting at drug and alcohol issues or anger management issues. And also there are some programs to improve their employment skills. Apart from the mandatory condition mentioned on the previous slide, when imposing an ICO, a court may also require the offender to submit to electronic monitoring, comply with a curfew, some random unannounced home visit, or any other restrictions or requirements. And this table here describes the level in place when ICO was first introduced. And offenders can progress or regress through these various levels of supervision, depending on their behavior. Now, level 1 conditions include a curfew, electronic monitoring, and at least weekly face-to-face contact with a supervisor. At level 4, there's no curfew or electronic monitoring, and the minimum required contact with the supervisor is every 6 weeks. The default starting level is level 2, except in some situation, electronic monitoring was mandated by the sentencing court. There are various stages the court must follow before an ICO could be made. The court must be satisfied that, having considered all possible alternatives, no penalty other than imprisonment is suitable. The court then determines the term of imprisonment without regard to the manner it is to be served. A court that has sentenced an offender to imprisonment for no more than 2 years may take an ICO. Also, ICO cannot be made in respect of a sentence of imprisonment for a sex offence. And to be eligible, the offender must be at least 18 years of age. Now, the court must refer the offender to the Commissioner of Corrective Service New South Wales for a suitability assessment before giving out an ICO. So in assessing an offender's suitability for an ICO, the Commissioner needs to consider a number of factors listed here. And this includes the age and the criminal history of the offender, the likelihood that he or she will reoffend, whether there's any risk associated with managing the offender in the community, the likelihood of committing a domestic violence offence, whether the offender will have suitable accommodation for the duration of the ICO, any drug and alcohol dependency, any physical mental health condition, and the availability of resources and intervention to address their offending behaviour. So a court may grant an ICO only if the assessment report says that the offender is a suitable person to serve the sentence by way of intensive correction in the community. But if the offender is assessed as not being suitable, then the court must then consider whether a suspended sentence or full-time imprisonment is more suitable in that case. So the aim of the study is to compare recidivism rate of offenders who receive an ICO with those who sentenced to short, and which is less than 2 years prison sentence. Now, what is the motivation behind this study and why is this an important comparison? New South Wales is experiencing unprecedented growth in the imprisonment numbers. In June 2017, we have 13,000 offenders in prison, and that's a 36% increase from 2013 to 2019. This rise in the prison numbers, as well as the strong evidence that prison has little to no deterrent effect, it has increased the urgency to find an effective alternative to imprisonment. And in fact, a large number of prisoners who are currently in custody, they have been sentenced to terms of less than 2 years and could therefore be eligible and potentially suitable for an ICO. So if we can compare the outcomes of the offenders who got an ICO with those who are serving a short prison sentence, it has important policy implications. If we found that ICO are indeed more effective than short prison sentence in addressing those underlying causes of underlying behavior, offending behavior, and reduce reoffending rates, then what we should recommend to the government is that we should expand their use. And that would have a significant impact on the imprisonment growth rate in New South Wales. The group of interest in this study consists of all adult offenders who receive an ICO as a principal penalty in New South Wales between the 1st of October 2010 and 30th of September 2012. And they were compared with offenders who receive a principal penalty of a short, which is less than 2 years, prison sentence during that same time period. The ICO eligibility criteria that I mentioned before, they were applied to both the ICO and the short prison sentence groups. So those who are less than 18 years of age, those who receive prison sentence longer than 2 years, and those being sentenced for a prescribed sexual offence, they were excluded from the analysis. The reoffending outcome that we look at is whether there was a further proven offence committed within 24 months free time after the index date. And the index date was defined as a date of the court finalisation relating to an ICO or a short prison sentence. And the treatment variable is whether the principal penalty received was an ICO or prison sentence after 2 years. Now, this is the first set of results. After we applied the selection criteria, we have eligible records of 10,660 offenders in the short prison sentence group and only 1,266 offenders in the ICO group. So the first thing you notice here is that there's a big difference between the number of offenders in each group. And this points to the fact that ICO was heavily underutilized, at least in that first 24 months since its commencement in October 2010. So our results showed that 24 months free time from the index finalization, around 35.7% of those who receive ICO are reoffended, and 58.3% of those in the prison sentence group reoffended. So can I conclude, based on this result, that we've just shown ICO relative to short prison sentence is more effective in reducing recidivism? Now, what's not taken into account in this crude comparison is any systematic differences between the groups of offenders on ICO and short prison sentence. And in fact, what we found is that those who got ICO, they were quite different from those who received prison sentence in terms of their demographic characteristics, their offense characteristics, their prior criminal history, and prior penalties received. And I'm going to talk about each one of these. Now, first, let me look at demographic characteristics. Compared to those who receive a short prison sentence, those who receive ICO, they were more likely to be younger or reside in major cities and less disadvantaged areas. Now, when looking at index offense characteristics, those in the ICO group, they were less likely to have a current theft, drug, justice procedure, or breach of violence order offense, and they were less likely to be in the higher LSIR risk categories. And I'll explain what LSIR mean later on. But those in the ICO group, they were more likely to have breached a custodial order. And when looking at prior criminal history, those offenders in the ICO, they were less likely to have higher number of court appearances with proven offense in 5 years prior. But they were more likely to have prior offense of fraud exceeding prescribed alcohol or other substance limit. They were less likely to receive a prior prison sentence or prior penalty of a driver license disqualification. So the set of results I've just presented show that they're non-trivial. In fact, there are statistically significant differences between the groups of comparison. And these differences must be accounted for when we compare the outcomes for the two groups. And this is because these factors which affect the type of penalty to receive might also affect the outcome, which is whether they reoffend or not. So that any difference we observe in the reoffending outcome, they might be confounded by these factors. So we need to think about ways where we can balance these factors between the two groups so we can isolate the treatment effect, which is the type of penalty they receive. So these observed factors that we need to control for are known as control variables. So the first set of control variables we include in our model are demographics, including the age of the offender at the index court appearance, their gender, indigenous status, remoteness of residence based on Accessibility Remoteness Index of Australia, which is ARIA. And we categorize area into major cities, inner regional, outer regional, remote, and very remote areas. CIFA, Socioeconomic Index for areas, which represent the disadvantage score of residents divided into quartiles, with the lowest quartile being the most disadvantaged. Now, the second set of control variables are the index offense characteristics, including the number of proven concurrent offenses and offense types. And we create a dummy variable for each offense type, including serious violence, act intended to cause injury, break and enter, theft, fraud, traffic, domestic violence, and etc. We also include prior offense characteristics, including the number of finalized court appearance for proven offense in 5 years prior offense types, and prior penalty types, such as imprisonment, home detention, suspended sentence, and etc. Now, the last control variable we include is the LSIR score, which stands for the level of service inventory revised. Now, this is an assessment tool that seeks to classify an offender's risk of reoffending, as well as to identify their particular criminogenic needs. So a low score indicates a low probability of committing future offenses, and a high score indicates a high probability. And we have the LSR data they'll provide to us by the Corrective Service New South Wales. Now, ideally, to assess causality, individuals are assigned randomly to treatment and control groups. Random allocation minimizes selection bias and maximizes the likelihood that any measured or unmeasured confounding variables are distributed equally, which means that any difference that we see between the treatment and control groups are due to the intervention, due to the treatment only. Now, this is a setting of a randomized control trial or RCT, and this is considered as the gold standard for assessing causality. But in many situations, random allocation of the intervention is not possible because of practical ethical reasons. And Jake can tell you that all about the helmet law, that you cannot randomize people, some people to wear a helmet and some people who do not wear a helmet, to assess the effectiveness of the bicycle helmet legislation. So one way we can balance these observed characteristics is through a weighting procedure. Now, the idea of weighting observation in sample surveys is to make the sample look more like the population if the sample you have is not quite representative of the population. But we want to use reweighting in the context of estimating causal effects. Now, suppose there is a gender difference between the treatment and the control groups, so that males, so this little person is a guy, so males are much more likely to be in the treatment group. Now, some of these males, even though they're very similar to other males, they ended up in the control group. So to estimate the causal effect for the group of males, it makes sense to compare the outcome for the outcomes of these few males in the control group with the outcomes of the males in the treatment group. Now, because we have lots of them in the treatment group and only few of them in the control group, we could upweight the males who are in the control group by giving them more importance, if you want, and downweight the males who were placed in the treatment group by giving them less importance, because we have lots of information on them already. Now, of course, in reality, we don't just have one difference like gender between the treatment and control groups. And as you've seen previously, there are many characteristics that are significantly different between the ICO and the short prison sentence group. So propensity score method is a way where you can come up with a single score that predicts the probability of receiving the treatment, when you can take into account all of these different factors. So we can use propensity score to balance observed covariates between the treated and the untreated groups, so to get an unbiased estimate of the treatment effect. They are typically estimated through a multivariable logistic regression model with the treatment type as the outcome variable. After you derive the propensity score, it can then be used in several ways, such as matching, stratification, and the method I'm going to use in this study is weighting. So we can use the propensity score to obtain a probability weight for each subject to create a population where the observed covariates and the treatment assignment are sort of independent of each other. So for those who receive ICO penalty, so ICO is the treatment here. The weight is simply the inverse of the propensity score, and this is known as the inverse probability of treatment weighting, or IPTW. And for those who did not receive ICO, those in the prison group, the weighting was the inverse of 1 minus the propensity score. So those who are underrepresented in the treatment group, they are given proportionally higher weights, while those who are highly represented, they are given lower weights. Now, these unstabilized weights can have the disadvantage that sometimes you can get very large weights if a treated individual has a very low propensity score. So it is suggested in the literature that we use something called stabilized weights. An additional strategy we can use to address the problem with extreme weights is to use trimmed or truncated weights. So in this study, we combine both methods by doing truncation after we stabilize the weights. Now, to illustrate the idea I just talked about, let's consider someone whose probability of receiving treatment is 0.8. And he ended up in a treatment group as expected. So his weight is the inverse of that, which is 1.25. Now we have someone else who's very similar, and his probability of receiving treatment is also 0.8. So this is the person on the right. However, he ended up in the control group. Now, he's rare and he's valuable for our comparison purpose. So his weight is 1 over 1 minus 0.8, so it's 5. Now, on the other hand, we have a group of people who's in the control group, we have a group of people who are not likely in the treatment group. So for this person in yellow shirt and orange pants, for this person who's in the control group as expected, his weight is 1.25. But for this person in the treatment group, he has low probability of receiving treatment, but he ended up in the treatment group. So we give him more weights. So you can see that this group of people in the red box, those are the underrepresented groups, and those are the interesting cases. So we give their data more importance. Now, just like any statistical model method, there are several assumptions. And the assumptions for IPTW, the first one is there is no unmeasured confounding, which means that there are no unmeasured variables that are different between the treatment and the control groups, and they also influence the outcome. So we need to make some theoretical arguments as to why we believe our study has collected all the important confounders. The second assumption is the correct specification of the propensity score model, but this is unverifiable. But it is suggested that we should be focusing on assessing whether weighting using the using propensity score induce balance of covariance between the treated and untreated groups. Another assumption is known as the positivity assumption, which says that all subjects must have a non-zero probability of receiving either treatment. And we can check for this assumption by looking at the mean of the stabilized weights, as well as the minimum and the maximum. So if the mean of the stabilized weights is far from 1, or if there are very extreme values, then this is evidence to indicate non-positivity. All right, some results. So in this table are the odds ratio estimates and the 95% confidence interval estimated from the 3 models of reoffending. The naive logistic regression model without any weighting, logistic regression model with IPTW, and the logistic regression model with trained stabilized IPTW. So those of you who are not familiar with odds ratio, just very briefly, odds ratio is commonly used in biostatistics and epidemiology, and it's just a measure of association between exposure and outcome. And odds ratio represents the odds of an outcome occur in the intervention group or the treatment group compared to the odds of the outcome occurring in the control group. So there was a statistically significant 31% reduction in the odds of reoffending for those who receive ICO as compared to those who receive short prison sentence. And this is from the logistic regression model with IPTW. And this effect was, the estimated effect was 27% reduction in the logistic regression model with trained stabilized IPTW. Now this effect was marginally insignificant with an estimated reduction of 11%. And this is from the naive logistic model. And we found these characteristics significantly associate with higher odds of reoffending. And these include identify as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders, having a proven theft, domestic violence, breach of public order offence, higher number of court appearances with proven offence in the previous 5 years, having prior offence of break and enter, dangerous neglect act, endangering persons, theft, illicit drugs, breach of public order, or against justice procedures. Reoffending was also more likely to occur among those who were in the higher LSIR risk categories. On the other hand, offenders who were female, older, lived in outer regional area, they were less likely to reoffend. Now we check balance on observed covariates based on the trim stabilized weights by running a series of regression models. None of the p-values was statistically significant, so this suggests that the specification of the propensity score result in a weighted sample where you have comparable balance across the two groups. We also check the mean and the range of the trim stabilized weights, and there's no evidence of non-positivity of the propensity score model. So just a recap of what we've done so far. So we found there are many variables that are statistically significantly different between the ICO and the short prison group that might also affect the outcome. Now these variables are known as confounders. Now if a confounder is observed and it can be measured, for example, age, indigenous status, then we can adjust for it using the inverse of propensity score weighting. Now, we've seen that one of the assumptions of IPTW is that there's no unmeasured confounding. But what do we do if a confounder is not observed? Now, for example, there might be some unobserved factors, some offender characteristics that correlate with both the choice of penalty and the risk of reoffending. Now, in this case, we have a problem known as endogeneity. And this would bias the estimate of the treatment effect of an ICO on reoffending. In some situations, we can find an instrument like a violin. No, not that instrument. All right, so an instrument is a measurable quantity. That's my joke, by the way. An instrument is a measurable quantity that is correlated with the treatment and is only related to the outcome via the treatment. So in our case, we are interested in looking at the causal effect of the type of penalty, whether it's ICO or short prison sentence, on whether someone reoffend or not. But there may be some unobserved or unmeasured factors that affect both the type of penalty and the reoffending outcome. Now we want to see if we can come up with an instrument that is causing the type of penalty, ICO or prison, but it has no direct influence on the outcome. Hence, I don't have an arrow going from the instrument to reoffending. But it affects the outcome only through the treatment. Okay, so the instrument influences the outcome only by the fact it influences the treatment, which in turn influences the outcome. So the key idea behind instrumental variable is that the choice of penalty that is caused by the instrument, that will be unconfounded because the change in the instrument will only change the treatment, but not the outcome. So we can use this to estimate the treatment effect. Now, in recent years, a number of studies have exploited the variation across judges in sentencing severity as an instrument. And we will use the same strategy in this study. Although there are very clear criteria regarding the eligibility for an ICO, but there is no legal obligation on a court to impose an ICO who meets the criteria. So we can exploit the variation across judges in their likelihood of imposing an ICO instead of a short prison sentence. So to construct the instrument, we divide the counts of ICOs imposed by each judge by the total number of ICO and the prison sentence imposed by the same judge during the study period. Now, suppose we have two judges. One is more lenient in the sense that he's more willing to give out ICO if you think ICO is the more lenient choice. And the other one who's harsher, and he's more likely to give out prison sentence. Now we have two defendants for whom we have observed information as well as some unobserved differences. Now the key is that the assignment of defendants to magistrate is random and therefore independent of offender characteristics. We have a natural experiment here. So if we compare the reoffending outcome between these two defendants, then any observed effect must be due to the differences in the penalty they receive. Now here's more detail for the statisticians. Both penalty choice and reoffending outcomes are dichotomous. We use a bivariate probate model that jointly models the penalty choice and reoffending outcome and including instrument. So the first equation specifies the relationship between reoffending and penalty choice and other control variables. And the second equation specifies the probability of ICO. A bivariate normal distribution is assumed for the error terms with correlation coefficient rho, and a negative rho would indicate that offenders who receive ICO, they were less likely to reoffend. Or we can also do a likelihood ratio test for this correlation as an indigeneity test for penalty choice. So if we fail to reject the null hypothesis of zero correlation, that means penalty choice is exogenous in the model. And in this situation, we don't need to model them jointly. We can just trust the result we get from the logistic regression model with propensity score adjustment. So results from the bivariate probate model, they were in agreement with those obtained from logistic regression model with weighting. And we found similar characteristics associated with higher likelihood of reoffending. The estimate of the correlation coefficient is negative 0.107, and it's not statistically significant. Therefore, there was not enough evidence to suggest penalty choice is endogenous. And we also perform a range of tests to see the instrument is indeed a strong instrument. Oops. Now, we also perform some supplementary analysis for some restricted cohort. Now, to see whether the effect of ICO is greater for high-risk offenders, we restrict the study population to offenders with medium to high LSIR risk categories, and then we compare the reoffending outcome. Secondly, the offenders in the prison group who are released to parole, they receive some form of supervision from the community after they are released. And it's possible that, at least for the medium to high risk offenders, those supervision they receive might closely resemble the treatment that offenders in the ICO group get. So the prison group, they was restricted to only include offenders serving a fixed prison term of 6 months or less, because those people would have received no supervision or treatment from the community corrections after they're released. So we perform separate analysis to look at the impact of ICO for these three groups. So group 1 is looking at the medium to high LSIR risk offenders, comparing ICO and short prison sentence up to 2 years. Group 2 is comparing ICO versus prison sentence up to 6 months in all the risk categories. And group 3 is where we combine the previous two restrictions and we look at medium to high risk offenders, comparing ICO with prison sentence up to 6 months. And this table shows the result of a supplementary analysis. So firstly, we compared ICO with a short prison sentence up to 2 years among those in the medium to high risk categories. So this is group 1. And we found a 20 to 30% reduction in the odds of reoffending, but most of these estimates were not statistically significant. Now, if you look at group 2, this is comparing ICO with fixed prison sentence up to 6 months. And here we found an estimated 25 to 43% reduction in the odds for offenders that's in all risk categories. And lastly, we estimate a 33 to 35% reduction in the odds for offenders in the medium to high LSIR categories. So just to summarize, our objectives was to see whether reoffending was lower among those who are on ICO than those comparable offenders given a short prison sentence. And to control for confounding, we used two approaches. The first one is using propensity score weighting that can balance the observed characteristics. But if there's unmeasured factors that influence both the choice of penalty and the outcome, we can use an instrumental variable approach. And the instrument we construct is the judge's likelihood of imposing an ICO. And our results suggest that offenders on ICO have significantly lower odds of reoffending than those on the short prison sentence after we adjust for these observed differences. And supplementary analysis showed that this reduction was even bigger when we restrict the prison group to 6 months or less. So the results we've just shown here further strengthen the evidence base that suggests supervision combined with rehabilitation programs, they can have a significant impact on the risk of reoffending. A review of ICO conducted by the New South Wales Sentencing Council in September 2016, they found that ICO were underutilized and they're not targeting offenders who could benefit the most from supervision and treatment. And the most significant barrier to the effective use of ICO was the mandatory community service work requirement. And this caused some disparity in the use of ICO across New South Wales. And they exclude individuals for whom intervention could possibly benefit, for example, offenders with mental illness or unstable housing. So the council recommends that ICO, as well as home detention, suspended sentence, to be replaced by a more flexible community-based custodial order. And based on these recommendations and the evidence that ICO was more effective in reducing recidivism, the New South Wales government implemented some reforms in September 2018, where home detention, suspended sentence, and existing ICO were replaced by this new ICO, where rather than making those mandatory conditions, the sentencing court can choose whether they want to add conditions such as electronic monitoring, community service work, and other requirements. So I hope that I've convinced you, or partially convinced you, that statistics or data science, whatever you want to call it, is crucial in understanding the impact of various programs and interventions in the criminal justice system. And not just in criminal justice system, in many other areas like health policy. And we as statisticians working in applied area need to think about how we can disseminate our research finding more effectively and work collaboratively with practitioners such that research evidence can successfully be integrated into policy decision-making. Thank you.